As we mentioned, a U.S. military ship is sailing towards the Middle East with equipment to build that temporary pier off Gaza's coast. The ship set sail from a military base in Virginia. The U.S. is building the pier to help try and get aid into Gaza by sea. According to the Pentagon, though, the construction could take up to 60 days. Jeremy Konyndyk is the president of Refugees International. He was also the director of USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. I spoke to him on Friday about that pier and why he says airdropping aid is actually inefficient. Jeremy Konyndyk, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Want to start with some news from the president in his State of the Union that the U.S. is going to build a temporary port of some kind off of Gaza's coast to receive humanitarian aid. What do you make of that plan? Is that is it a good plan? Will it be a good alternative for them?
Well, at this point, the situation is so desperate that anything that helps to get more aid in is a positive thing. But I think there's a difference between helpful and adequate. It is helpful if it brings more in. It is nowhere near adequate to the level of need that exists. What's always important to keep in kind of the forefront of your mind is that there is now a famine getting underway. There have been predictions of famine looming going back to December. Those are now coming into fruition. There are numerous reports coming out of children dying of starvation in the health system. You know, when you see that level of starvation and some of the images that we've seen of babies who are skeletal, it's reminiscent of crises that I've worked on in Somalia or Yemen. Mm-hmm. That is now the situation that Gaza is in, and a port airdrops are not going to be sufficient to offset that. It will really require a ceasefire and full operational access for humanitarian agencies to get a handle on where things now stand.
I want to ask you about airdropping aid as well, but just to go back to the idea of the port, I mean, I can see just myself imagining the challenges that would be there. Obviously, Israel would still have a say in what gets in. How would the things get in? How would it get distributed? I mean, like, is there any way for that to happen, unfold quickly enough to make a difference on the issues that you're talking about, the dire issues?
Not on the timeline that's required. And David Cameron was speaking about this earlier today and said this doesn't mean we don't also need Israel to open up Ashdod port, to allow overland transport, to allow access for aid groups. It's not entirely clear how long it will take to set up this floating pier operation that the U.S. military has talked about. It's certainly not going to be quick. No. And, on some level, this feels like almost a diversion from the things that really need to happen and which could happen tomorrow, which are the Israeli government expediting aid across the border crossings that already exist overland between Israel and Gaza, allowing in aid groups who are ready and willing to move aid through those crossings, and allowing aid up from the south as well. The UN and NGOs have been repeatedly requesting the ability to move aid up from the south. Most of those requests for the last several months have been denied by the Israeli government.
The U.S., to go back to the airdropping idea, the U.S. dropped some aid for the third time in less than a week. You were head of the USAID's U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance Program, and you oversaw these kinds of things. I believe even today, though, that the Hamas-run health ministry said, I think 5 people were killed when an airdrop went down and the parachute didn't open, which is horrifying. Tell me why you think airdropping is not necessarily the best way forward, even when you're faced with all these challenges.
So it is an absolute last resort, and you normally only use that if there is a complete physical blockage on getting aid through other means to the population. Here, the physical blockage is, again, primarily the Israeli government and the Israeli military. And so it does, again, feel like a kind of a way to circumvent the behavior of a government that, in principle, is an ally of the United States and as a partner of the United States, and yet here is not allowing aid to move in a more efficient way and forcing the U.S. government to resort to these airdrops, which are very expensive, very inefficient, and as we saw with the deaths today, also pretty risky.
Yeah. Let me ask you about funding for UNRWA. Canada is one of the countries that suspended funding after, I think it was 9 employees were somehow involved with Hamas and the attacks there. Those people were fired. Another number of people were also killed. There is a consideration about restarting that funding or making sure that people get that funding back. How significant is that? Like, is that really important for UNRWA to have that funding, or can the money not just go to other aid organizations that are operating over there?
It is really essential to continue funding UNRWA right now. UNRWA has long been the backbone of the entire humanitarian aid operation within Gaza. Many of the other aid agencies rely on UNRWA's logistical infrastructure to enable their own distribution. The other UN agencies have all said that. Even MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, has said that in testimony to the UN Security Council. So if UNRWA goes away, that doesn't just remove UNRWA from the field, it actually greatly hampers the ability of the rest of the international system to mount the kind of response that we need.
Let me end on this. You have responded to conflicts in all sorts of places, earthquakes, Yazidis fleeing ISIS, I understand. Give me a sense of how this compares, what we're seeing in Gaza, how it compares to other things you've seen, while understanding that every situation is obviously quite different.
I think what is really stunning here is the speed at which famine has come on. So I worked on the 2011 famine in Somalia, for example. Mm-hmm. That took several failed rainy seasons over a long period. And of course, Somalia, you've got a very high baseline level of vulnerability amongst the population there to begin with. Here, this was not a population that was particularly food insecure prior to the war. There has been no natural disaster that disrupted their food production, and it's happened amazingly fast. So in 5 months, you've got a population that was basically stable from a food security point of view, now having children dying of malnutrition in the hospitals. The type of crisis we're seeing here is very reminiscent of what we've seen in the famine in Somalia, what we've seen in the crisis in Yemen a few years ago. What is astonishing here is just the speed of the descent.
Okay, Jeremy Konyndyk, thank you for your expertise on this. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.